Okay, so today we're going to be learning about the statue of Daniel 2 and what it means for today. So let's get some context. This is Daniel 2, and there's this guy named Nebuchadnezzar. He was the king of Babylon, and he has this dream about a statue. He's really perplexed about it, and he's trying to figure out, what does this mean? The statue that he sees in his dream has a head made of solid gold, and his chest and arms are made out of silver. Then when he looks further down, he notices that his thighs are made out of brass. The statue has these big iron legs, and then the feet are mixed with iron and clay. Then he notices there's this rock that kind of heads toward the statue, aimed right at the feet, and breaks the statue up, and then seems to take over the whole space where the statue used to be and become the new thing that's in its place. Okay, so the head of gold, according to Daniel 2:38, is Babylon. The Bible just comes right out and announces it. It says, "You, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, are that head of gold." That must have made King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the reigning monarch of the then known world, feel pretty good. Daniel 2 verse 39 says that after that gold head rises another kingdom symbolized by the silver, but it says this kingdom would be inferior to Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. To find out who's the kingdom that comes after the gold head, we go to Daniel 5:28. Here's what it says. The kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So now we have that answer. The gold head was Babylon, and the silver chest is Medo-Persia. Okay, just to make sure we're on the right trail, let's find the same answer in a different text. When you go to Daniel 8 verse 20, it gives the same information, only this time using animals as the symbols, and it bears it out. The next one is Medo-Persia. Okay, great. Now we need to figure out, what is the next kingdom in line, symbolized by the brass thighs? Okay, remember in Daniel 8:20 where we found the exact same information as in the statue, only this time symbolized by animals? We found there that Medo-Persia was the next one. Well, let's go one verse down to verse 21. That is the next clue. Okay, so as a quick review, in verse 20, Medo-Persia was symbolized as a ram. However, when we go down one verse to 21, we notice that ram was beaten up by a goat. The goat was Greece. It says it. If you like puzzles, this is a blast. We now have our next answer to plug into the statue. The thighs of brass are Greece. Okay, so far as a quick recap, the head is gold. That's Babylon. The chest is silver. That's Medo-Persia. The brass thighs are Greece. Okay, now, if you're familiar with the Bible, you probably noticed that not only does the statue predict each world power, it also shows what day-to-day life was like under their rulership. That's just a really good confirmation that the Bible is legit. There is an exception, and that's Greece, and we'll explain that in a minute. Let me show you what I mean. The statue predicts Babylonian reign, and then the Bible shows you what daily life in Babylon was like when you read books like the book of Daniel. The statue predicts Medo-Persia will succeed Babylon, and when it does, you can read all about life in Medo-Persia when you check out books like Esther in the Bible. It's all there. The statue then predicts Greece. Therefore, we would expect to see life under Grecian rule too, right? It turns out that the period Greece ruled comes after Malachi, which is the last book in part 1 of the Bible, called the Old Testament. And Greece is wrapping up its rule by the time we enter into part 2 of the Bible, which begins with the Gospels, books called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Therefore, that space between the Old and New Testaments is where we would insert a book or two about Grecian life. But since that's not there, let's see if we can find some hints of Grecian rule in the New Testament. In addition to the fact that the whole New Testament is written in Greek, there's an additional clue that gives us a pretty big indicator that Greece was indeed a world power. Here, come on, I'll show you. You see, in Luke 1 verse 5, it reads, "There was in the days of Herod, king of Judea." Okay, stop. It turns out that Herod is also known as Herod the Great, and it's widely published that he was the Hellenistic king of Judea. Judea had formerly been part of the Greek Empire of the Alexander the Great. So Herod the Great then was still pushing Grecian philosophy, making Greek buildings, etc. And so this makes Herod the Great the linchpin between Medo-Persia and the upcoming world power that is represented by the iron legs. He is the confirmation that Greece was the world power. Okay, so that said, it's interesting to find out, how did he get into power? Well, it turns out Mark Antony used his influence to gain Herod his position as king of Judea. The thing is, Mark Antony got into a little scuffle, shall we say, with a guy named Octavius. Well, Octavius wins, and he turns out to be the next world ruler. He changes his name to Caesar Augustus. And that's what lands us into our clue for who is that next world power. We read in Luke 2 verse 1, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed." Okay, that's our clue. Octavius is the new reigning power. He is giving out decrees and the whole world is following him. The next reigning power of the world is Rome. When Jesus was born, raised, and then ultimately crucified on the cross, notice that first he was shuffled to Herod, then he was shuffled over to Pilate. That's because Herod was not in charge, Rome was. So enough about that. Let's go on to the feat of iron and clay. After Rome fell, it divided into 10 kingdoms or nations. 3 of those nations were exterminated: Heruli, Ostrogoths, and Vandals. The remaining 7 nations are what we know today as England, Switzerland, Italy, France, Germany, Portugal, and Spain. When Rome, represented by the iron legs, fell, it divided into 10 nations, the ones that I just mentioned. And those are represented in the feet with 10 toes of iron and clay mixed together. And it doesn't stop there. After Rome divides into the 10 European nations, the iron, which is Rome, actually mingles throughout both of the feet, right through to the toes, symbolizing that it mingles throughout the entire world. So even though Rome is not the world power anymore by the time we reach the feet of iron and Myri Clay, it is still very clear that Rome, dispersed throughout the world, still makes its strength and power felt and known worldwide. And by the way, this is the part of the statue that you and I are living in right now. Let's go to the Bible to see if we can find scriptural support for what we've just talked about for the feet of iron and Myri Clay. Daniel 2:43 says, "And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with Myri Clay," stop. What is Myri and what is clay? Myri has to do with muck, dirt, sinking sand. Jeremiah 18:6 calls clay God's people because in the hands of the potter who is molding the clay, he uses the analogy that God's people are being molded by him. You can find a similar analogy in Isaiah 64 verse 8. So putting the two things together then, if we have Myri Clay, then we have God's people, or to shorten that up, his church, joined with dirt. So it sounds like this version of clay is not pure, like you would expect God's church to be. Instead, it's an apostate church, a church that is tainted, and thus it's not really God's church at all. Thus, this feat depicted in the statue of iron mingled with Myri Clay represents Rome mingling with apostate churches. And before we got to the feet, which is mingling iron and Myri Clay together, remember the previous world power was solid iron. There was no mingling there, but there's still remnants of that iron from the legs in the feet mingled with this Myri Clay. So knowing that this was a world power, and another way of saying that would be a state power, you can know for sure that here is a depiction of church and state mingling together. And whenever you have church and state mingling together, you also have persecution, because the two just don't mix. And to get people to do what they want them to do, that means they have to try coercion and force. Another way to look at this is to see if Myri Clay shows up anywhere else in the Bible, and if it does, to observe what it's defined as in that context. So let's take a quick look at Psalm 69 verse 14. David is here talking, and he is saying, "Deliver me out of the mire and let me not sink. Let me be delivered from them that hate me." Okay, stop again. He is calling mire those that hate him, and he represents God's anointed. If he is God's anointed, we can look at this as Rome is mingled with mire, or mingled with those who hate God's anointed, or those who hate God's people. So in another sense, we talked about Rome representing state power or world power and mixing or mingling with apostate churches. So that's the mingling of church and state together. Another way to look at this is Rome is mingling with those who hate God's people, because when we look at David's use of the word mire, he says that represents those who hate him, and we know that he represents God's anointed. He represents God's people. So, second definition of this Myri Clay and iron mix is this. It is Rome mingling with those who hate God's people. Okay, let's show back up on the scene with Daniel in Daniel 2 verse 43, where he actually says that this iron and clay are mixing together. All right, as a brief recap, let's read part of that again. It says, "Whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men." Stop again. As Daniel is telling King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, what his dream means, and he gets down to the feet mingled with iron and clay, he says, "Whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men." So now what we want to know is, what is the seed of men? We already know that iron represents Rome. So now we want to know, who is Rome mingling with? And Daniel answers this question by saying that Rome is mingling with the seed of men. So that is why we need to get clarity on what is the seed of men. Okay, so in Jeremiah 31 verse 27, you'll notice that it's talking about God creating a new covenant. And among other things, he says, "What I want to do for my people, the house of Israel, is to bless them with the seed of men and with the seed of beasts." In other words, he wants to multiply the people among them and multiply their prosperity via the amount of beasts that they have. So the seed of men, very practically speaking, and defined right here in the Word of God, is many people. Let's bear that out in one other text. In Genesis 6, verses 1 and 2, it talks about how the people began to multiply on the earth. And it talks about how the daughters were born to them, and the sons of God saw the daughters of men. Stop right there. So there we go again, the seed of men, which in this particular reference happens to be the female seed of men. But if we took it generally, we would understand that to be just the multiplication of mankind. So we know then that the seed of men are simply the people all over the earth. That is who Rome is mingling with. And unlike the legs of iron, where they were the sole reigning power of the world, they are now exercising their power by mingling among the different kings and nations of the earth. That's happening right now. Here's where I'll slip in one more very cool factoid. If you slip over to Psalm 69 verse 2, you'll notice here that David again is talking about sinking in the mire. And when you look that up in Strong's Concordance, that word mire in Aramaic is yaven, and that is associated with wine bibbers, or those who become drunk from wine. And it's interesting to see that when we put that with the word seed of men, we're coming up with the concept that Rome is mixing with all the kingdoms of the earth, the seed of men who are drunk from drinking all the wine. Does that sound familiar to you? Hopefully it does, because in Revelation 18 verse 3, it talks about all the nations drinking of the wine of Babylon. And In this Revelation 18:3 reference, Babylon symbolizes Rome, just like Rome is symbolized in the statue as iron in the mingled iron and clay mixture found in the feet and toes. Isn't that fascinating? Also in Revelation 13 verse 3, it says, all the world wonders after the beast. And here goes Rome again. This time it's showing up symbolized as a beast in this Revelation 13:3 verse. We won't unpack right now how we know the beast symbolizes Rome, but just know that in this case, all roads really do lead to Rome. Okay, so we covered a lot as we evaluated what it meant to have feet of Myri Clay mingled with iron. So let's just do a final recap of that before we head on to the last part of the stream. Number 1, Rome is mingling with an apostate church because we know that clay is symbolized in Jeremiah 18:6 as God's people or God's church. However, since it's Myri Clay, we are saying that this is an apostate church, a tainted church, a church that is corrupt. It's promoting corrupt principles, and therefore it's adulterated and not really God's church at all. Number 2, Rome is mingling with those who hate God's people. Psalm 69:14 shows us that David calls Myr those who hate him, and he represents God's anointed or God's people. Therefore, if iron is mixing with Myr, then Rome, which is iron, is mixing with those who hate God's people. Number 3, Rome is mingling with all the people of the earth. How do we come to that conclusion? Because in Daniel 2:43, Daniel directly says that Rome, which is iron, is mixing with seed of men. So we went to Genesis 6 verse 2 as well as Jeremiah 31 verse 27, and we learned that seed of men refers to men and women of the earth who have multiplied and do not worship God. In addition to that, we noticed in Psalm 69 verse 2 that the word Myr is Yavin, which means mire or clay, and when we took a deeper look at that, we noticed that it related directly to the word wine or wine bibber. And so putting that together with seed of men, we get men and women of the world who are drunk with the wine. That should make you think about the verse in Revelation 18 verse 3 where it says, all nations drink of the wine of Babylon. And Babylon in this specific reference is a direct reference to Rome. Revelation 13 verse 3 says something similar. All the world, we could insert here, all the seed of men wonder after the beast. And the beast in this particular reference again is referring to Rome. And so as we look at the feet of iron and Myri Clay, we see Rome mingling with all the people of the world and causing them to be drunk with the wine that they are putting out. Okay, so now it's time to head on to this rock that's aimed straight at this feet of Myri Clay and iron, and it actually breaks the entire statue down and installs itself as the new, final, and permanent world power. What is this rock, and who is this permanent world power? Daniel gives us the answer to this question in Daniel 2 verse 44. It's God. God's kingdom is the one that gets installed, tears down all other kingdoms, and remains in place forever. One of God's signatures as you read the word of God, when it's him and his handiwork and what he has done in more than one instance, it says, this is the kind of work that's done without hands, as if to say, no human hand has done this. This is supernatural work here. You can read that in verse 45. It says, the mountain was cut out without hands. You can see similar references in Mark 14:58, 2 Corinthians 5:1, and Colossians 2:11. All of those speak about God's work, and it doesn't include human hands. He did it. And when he does something, it's permanent, it lasts, and it's good. No corruption at all. Okay, my friends, so that's Daniel 2 and the dreamed statue in a nutshell. I hope you have clarity, and I hope you will be interested enough to go and look at more of Daniel's fascinating prophetic words. I hope this inspires confidence in a God who knows the future. He knows your future too. So as long as you stick with him, you're in good hands. Have a great one. See you next time.